6 years ago, Nora sat in a sterile Manhattan penthouse and signed away her livelihood, biting the inside of her cheek until she tasted iron just to keep from sobbing. She took his severance check, packed 2 suitcases, and vanished into the fog of the Maine coastline, carrying his unborn son. Today, the man who owns half the city's concrete just walked into a rundown diner in Westbrook and froze, staring into the face of a 5-year-old boy with his exact, unforgiving eyes. The air in the 42nd floor boardroom didn't smell like high finance. It smelled like industrial lemon floor wax and the damp wool of Richard Morrison's expensive suit. Nora sat with her knees pressed together beneath the mahogany table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Inside her leather purse, resting right beneath her house keys and a half-eaten roll of peppermint antacids, was a white plastic wand. It had 2 distinct pink lines across its tiny digital window. She had taken the test at 6:15 a.m. in a Queens subway station bathroom, the rumble of the 7 train vibrating through the soles of her cheap pumps, while the chemical strip slowly dictated the rest of her natural life. Across the table, Richard Victor Callahan's chief legal counsel slid a manila folder toward her. The paper made a dry, rasping sound against the wood. "The terms are standard, Miss Mercer," Richard said. His voice had the smooth, frictionless quality of a man who spent his life sanitizing catastrophe. 2 years of your current base salary, paid out in a single lump sum, to an account of your choosing. Full continuation of your health coverage for 18 months. In exchange, Section 4 stipulates a standard, non-negotiable, non-disclosure agreement regarding anything you've seen heard or transcribed during your 14 months attached to the executive office. Nora didn't look at the document. She looked past Richard's shoulder, through the floor-to-ceiling glass, out into the grey November sleet over Midtown. Standing by the glass, his back entirely turned to the room, was Victor. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that hugged the wide, tense set of his shoulders. His left hand was tucked into his trouser pocket. His right held a heavy glass of seltzer with a single lime wheel floating dead at the top. He hadn't spoken a single word since Nora walked into the room 10 minutes ago. He hadn't even looked at her shoes. "The health coverage," Nora said. Her voice came out thinner than she intended. She cleared her throat, forcing the pitch down into her chest. "Does it cover out-of-state networks?" Richard blinked, slightly thrown off his script. "Ah, yes. It's a Tier 1 PPO. It covers any registered practitioner in the continental United States. Is there a specific regional transfer you're contemplating?" "No," Nora said quietly. She reached into her purse. Her fingers brushed the cold plastic of the pregnancy test. For one wild, hysterical second, she imagined pulling it out instead of her pen slamming it onto the polished mahogany, letting it skitter across the table until it tapped against Victor's polished Oxford shoes. She imagined screaming at the back of his head, "Look at it! Turn around and look at what your late nights and your locked doors made." Instead, her fingers bypassed the plastic wand and closed around a cheap blue Bic pen. She pulled the folder closer. The text was dense, typed in 10-point Garamond. "The undersigned hereby forfeits any claim, moral or financial, to the assets, operations, or personal affairs of Callahan Logistics and its subsidiaries." "Victor," she said. The syllable dropped into the room like a stone into a dry well. Richard stiffened. By the window, the broad shoulders didn't move, but the ice in Victor's glass gave a tiny, sharp clink against the crystal as his grip tightened. "Is this because of the subpoena in Delaware?" she asked, her voice steadying into something cold and remarkably dead. "Or is it just spring cleaning?" 10 seconds passed. The HVAC system hummed its low synthetic B-flat. When Victor finally spoke, his voice didn't carry across the room. It seemed to scrape along the floorboards. "Sign the paper, Nora." He didn't turn around. That was the detail that finally killed the last stubborn green shoot of stupid girlhood left inside her. Not the dismissal itself she had known from week 3, that sleeping with a man whose family name was whispered in federal RICO indictments had an expiration date. It was the refusal to witness the execution. He was clearing his board of soft targets because the street was getting hot, and he couldn't even grant her the dignity of eye contact while he threw her overboard. Nora uncapped the bic. She didn't read Section 5. She didn't read Section 8. She pressed the ballpoint to the blue line at the bottom of page 14 and wrote Nora Jane Mercer in a sharp, jagged script that tore the top layer of the pulp. A single drop of salt water fell from her chin, landing precisely on the cursive J of her middle name, blurring the blue ink into a tiny feathered spider. She capped the pen, stood up, and slung her purse over her shoulder. "Keep the copy," she told Richard. She walked to the double doors, her heels clicking a sharp staccato retreat. She didn't look back at the glass. She didn't look back at the man. She took the elevator down 42 floors in absolute breath-holding silence, walked out into the sleet on 4th Avenue, leaned over a municipal trash can, and threw up her morning toast. Westbrook, Maine didn't care about Manhattan. Westbrook cared about the price of winter heating oil, the tide schedule for the lobstermen, and whether the snowplows would get to Route 1 before the morning school bus run. It was a good place to hide a ghost. 5 years and 8 months later, Nora stood at the kitchen counter of a small, drafty 2-bedroom rental that smelled permanently of cedar shingles and burnt Folgers. She was $42 short on the monthly electric budget. She stood there with a yellow pad and a dull pencil, doing the brutal everyday math of the American working class if she bought the generic brand of children's Zartek instead of the name brand, and skipped the oil change on the 2008 Subaru for another 3,000 miles. She could cover the utility bill and still have $12 left over for the kindergarten book fare. "Mom!" Nora didn't look up from her column of figures. "In a minute, Owen. Put your sneakers on. The left one has a bite in it." Nora sighed, setting the pencil down. She turned around. Owen was sitting on the threadbare rug by the front door, holding up his left New Balance sneaker. The rubber sole had finally delaminated from the foam toe box, flapping open like a tired mouth. He was 5.5 years old, small for his age, with a mop of unruly dark hair that refused to take a side part. "It's not a bite, sweetie. It's just old glue," Nora said, kneeling beside him. She took the shoe, inspecting the damage. "We'll put some Gorilla Glue on it tonight. It'll hold till spring." Owen didn't complain. He didn't whine for new ones. He simply sat back on his haunches, rested his elbows on his little knees, and rubbed his right thumb slowly over the knuckle of his left index finger. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Nora froze the broken sneaker in her hand. Her heart did that familiar, sickening little drop, the one it did every time her son accidentally unmasked his donor. It wasn't just the dark hair. It wasn't just the heavy hooded shape of his dark grey eyes. It was the micro-mannerisms. When Owen was deeply frustrated, he didn't throw tantrums. His face went entirely blank. His jaw locked into a tiny, stubborn square, and he rubbed that exact knuckle. Victor Callahan had done that during every board meeting involving a supply chain delay. "He's mine," Nora told herself fiercely, pulling the shoe back onto the boy's foot and tying the double knot with rough, shaking efficiency. "He belongs to the public school system of Cumberland County and the pediatric clinic on Elm Street. He doesn't belong to a man who lives behind bulletproof glass." For nearly 6 years, her system had worked. She had changed her phone number 4 times. She worked as the daytime logistics dispatcher for Holloway Freight, a local trucking outfit that hauled timber and frozen potatoes down to Boston. It was an anonymous, paper-heavy job that paid $23 an hour, just enough to keep them fed, clothed, and strictly off the radar of the social safety nets that required extensive background pings. Then came October 14th. It started with a fever of 103.4. By midnight, Owen was making a wet whistling sound at the bottom of his lungs that sounded like wind blowing through a cracked window. The local urgent care took one look at his oxygen saturation levels and put them in an ambulance heading straight south to Boston Children's Hospital. It was acute lobar pneumonia, complicated by a severe pleural effusion. For 4 days, Nora sat in a plastic chair beside a stainless steel crib, watching a monitor trace her son's heartbeat in glowing green peaks. When the crisis passed on day 5, and the pediatric pulmonologist finally smiled and said the word discharge, Nora walked down to the hospital's financial counseling office to settle the intake paperwork. The woman behind the desk printed out an itemized estimate. The out-of-network deductible for the emergency transport and the 5-day ICU stay was $14,200. We offer a 12-month installment plan, the clerk said, kindly looking at Nora's tired, bloodshot eyes. Or we can run Medicaid eligibility right now if you have your tax returns on hand. Nora looked at the number. $14,200. If she took the installment plan, it was over $1,000 a month. Her take-home pay was $2,600. I have an account, Nora said. The words tasted like ash. She walked down to the basement cafeteria, sat at a sticky laminate table, opened her phone's browser, and typed in the web address of a major commercial bank she hadn't logged into since the Obama administration. She entered her maiden name. She entered the old 9-digit routing code. The screen loaded. Account balance: $184,512. It was the remainder of Victor's severance payout. She had left it sitting there in a high-yield holding trust, treating it like radioactive waste money generated by extortion protection rackets and the quiet intimidation of waterfront unions. Touching it felt like breaking a quarantine. He's 5, she thought, her thumb hovering over the wire transfer button. He needs his lungs to work. Pride is a luxury for women who have husbands. She typed in the hospital's billing routing number. She hit submit. 300 miles away, in a windowless server room on the 14th floor of a high-security office building in Lower Manhattan, an automated compliance algorithm written specifically to track any financial movement tied to dormant Callahan. Logistics tax IDs flagged a green notification onto a supervisor's desktop. By 4 p.m. that afternoon, a printed piece of paper was placed onto Victor Callahan's desk. It contained a single line of data, routing confirmation. Boston Children's Medical Center. Remitter Mercer N. Amount $14,200. It rained the following Tuesday in Westbrook, a cold, sideways Atlantic downpour that turned the gravel parking lot of Marconi's Diner into a series of muddy brown lakes. It was 4:30 p.m. The diner was mostly empty, save for 2 telephone linemen drinking coffee at the counter, and old Mr. Henderson reading the local Gazette in the corner booth. Nora sat at booth number 4, her wet raincoat draped over the vinyl seatback. Across from her, Owen was methodically dipping a grilled cheese sandwich into a small ceramic bowl of tomato soup. Nora had her laptop open, cross-checking Holloway Freight's driver logs for the morning shift. Her mind was entirely occupied by a missing pallet of frozen cod. The brass bell above the diner's front door gave its standard, cheerful ding. Nora didn't look up. People came into Marconi's all day to get out of the rain. Then she heard the footsteps. They didn't make the standard wet, rubber-soled squeak of Maine locals wearing bean boots. They made a heavy, dry, rhythmic thud-click against the checkerboard linoleum. It was the sound of hand-welted Italian leather walking across a cheap floor. The ambient noise in the diner died. At the counter, Patty, the 60-year-old waitress, who had been pouring coffee at Marconi's since the Carter administration, stopped mid-pour. The brown stream of Maxwell House halted. The two telephone linemen slowly turned their heads toward the door. Nora's fingers stopped over her laptop keyboard. A cold, creeping paralysis started at the base of her skull and radiated down her spine, locking her shoulder blades together. "Don't look up!" her brain screamed. "It's a salesman. It's a real estate developer looking at the mill property down the street. Don't look up." The footsteps didn't go to the counter. They didn't go to the restroom. They walked down the narrow center aisle between the red vinyl booths, stopping precisely 2 feet from the edge of Nora's table. Nora raised her eyes. Victor Callahan looked older. That was the first jarring realization her brain managed to process through the spike of pure adrenaline. The silver at his temples wasn't just a few threads anymore. It was solid, thick, tracing the hard line of his jaw. The charcoal overcoat he wore was damp at the shoulders from the 30-foot walk from the parking lot. His face was leaner, the skin drawn tighter over the cheekbones, giving him the hollowed-out look of a man who hadn't slept a full 6 hours since the Obama presidency. He didn't look at Nora. His eyes, cold, dark, completely devoid of whatever light normal human beings use to navigate the world, were fixed entirely on the small boy sitting on the opposite side of the table. Owen had his sandwich halfway to his mouth. He paused. A drop of orange tomato soup fell from the corner of the sourdough bread, landing with a soft splat on the formica table. The boy didn't shrink back. He didn't hide behind his mother's laptop. He simply lowered the sandwich back into the bowl, set his elbows on the table, locked his jaw into a tiny square, and stared back at the giant standing in the aisle. Then slowly Owen's right thumb went to his left knuckle. Scrape. Scrape. Victor's breath caught. It wasn't a dramatic gasp. It was a sharp, jagged hitch in his chest, as if someone had just driven a 3-inch framing nail directly through his breastbone. His right hand, the hand that had signed off on the hostile takeover of half the eastern seaboard's shipping infrastructure, dropped to the edge of the table to steady himself. His knuckles were bone white. "Nora," Victor said. His voice didn't sound like the boardroom anymore. It sounded like a man speaking through a throat full of gravel. Nora didn't stand up. She reached out her hand, moving with deliberate, terrifying slowness, and closed the lid of her laptop. "Lick. You're standing in the aisle," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of pitch, a dead wire. "You're blocking the waitress." Victor didn't hear her. His eyes hadn't left Owen's face. He took one slow step forward and slid into the red vinyl booth sitting directly across from the boy crowding the small table with his massive wool-clad frame. Up close, the smell of him hit her cedarwood rain and the faint, unmistakable scent of expensive tobacco. 6 years of distance evaporated in 3 seconds. She was 25 again, sitting in the back of a town car heading down the FDR Drive, pretending she didn't know what was inside the locked briefcase in the trunk. "What's your name?" Victor asked. He didn't ask Nora. He spoke directly to the boy, his voice dropping into a register so low it vibrated against the tabletop. Owen looked at his mother first. Nora gave a single microscopic nod. "Answer him." "Don't show him fear." "Owen," the boy said. "Owen what?" "Owen Mercer." Victor's jaw rippled. He reached out toward the center of the table. Nora's hand instantly shot out her fingernails, digging into the wood, ready to flip the heavy ceramic soup bowl directly into his face if his fingers got within 6 inches of her son. But Victor didn't reach for the boy. He reached for the paper napkin dispenser. He pulled out a single white napkin. His hands were shaking. Victor Callahan, the man who had reportedly sat through a 3-hour federal grand jury deposition without his heart rate exceeding 72 beats per minute, had a visible tremor in his left index finger. He set the napkin over the spilled drop of tomato soup, pressing it down with his thumb until the orange liquid bled through the paper. "How old are you, Owen?" Victor asked softly. "5, Owen said. Then, with the pedantic precision of all small children, he added, "And 5 months. My birthday was in June." Victor closed his eyes. The math was simple. It was elementary school arithmetic. June. Subtract 9 months. That placed conception in September of 6 years ago, 2 months before a manila folder was slid across a 42nd floor table in Manhattan. When Victor opened his eyes, the emptiness in them was gone. It had been replaced by something infinitely more dangerous, absolute territorial certainty. He finally looked at Nora. "Pack his things," Victor said. "Pack his things." The command hit the humid air of Marconi's diner and died there, absorbed by the damp acoustic ceiling tiles and the smell of frying canola oil. Nora didn't flinch. 6 years ago, that tone would have sent her scrambling for her notepad, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Today, her heart maintained its slow, stubborn, working-class rhythm. She looked down at her son's half-empty bowl of soup, then back up at the man whose face used to haunt her bathroom mirrors. "No," Nora said. Victor's eyebrows twitched a fraction of a millimeter, the only outward sign of a systemic shock. "Nora, you're in Cumberland County, Victor," she said, her voice dropping into a register as flat and hard as the asphalt on Route 1. "You aren't in Manhattan. You don't have 3 tiers of junior partners waiting outside the door with indemnity waivers, and you don't own the deed to this building. If you put a single hand on my son's coat, Patty is going to hit the silent panic button behind the register, and Deputy Morrison is going to be in this parking lot in 4 minutes. At the counter, Patty hadn't moved. She was still holding the glass pot of Maxwell House, her eyes fixed on Victor's broad shoulders, with the universal, flinty suspicion small-town New Englanders reserved for men in expensive topcoats. Victor didn't look at Patty. He leaned inches closer across the Formica table. He belongs in a facility with a dedicated pediatric pulmonary wing. I saw the intake scans from Boston, Nora. His left lower lobe is 70% consolidated. You are treating a serious pleural infection with a clinic prescription and an over-the-counter humidifier. I am treating him with what my paycheck allows. She snapped the icy veneer, cracking just enough to let the raw, bleeding frustration of the last 3 weeks bleed through. And he is getting better. His fever broke 4 days ago. He breathes like he's pulling air through a wet sponge, Victor said. His voice wasn't cruel, it was factual, devastatingly objective. It was the tone he used when pointing out that a cargo ship had structural hull rot. I have a medical transport idling behind the kitchen. There is a team at Massachusetts General waiting for my call. We can do this with your cooperation, or we can do it after I wake up a superior court judge in Portland and file an emergency petition for temporary medical conservatorship. Nora felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin cold and prickling. He would do it. That was the terror of Victor Callahan. He didn't carry guns into diners. He carried the weaponized machinery of the American legal system. He would hire 3 Portland law firms before breakfast, bury her in emergency injunctions, subpoena her bank accounts, and paint her to a family court judge as an unstable, financially insolvent flight risk who had hidden a medical crisis from a willing, wealthy father. Beside her, Owen set his spoon down. "Clink. My chest doesn't hurt today," the boy said clearly. Victor stopped. His gaze dropped from Nora's furious eyes to Owen's small, pale face. The intense, predatory focus that defined his posture suddenly softened into something deeply awkward, almost clumsy. "It doesn't," Victor asked, his voice dropping an octave. "No," Owen said, picking up his sourdough crust and examining it. "Only when I run up the hill behind the school. Mum says I have to walk like an old lady until the snow comes." A tiny, involuntary muscle jumped in Victor's jaw. He reached into his coat pocket. Nora's hand instantly tensed, but he didn't pull out a phone or a legal document. He pulled out a small, heavy silver coin, an old 1921 Morgan silver dollar, worn smooth at the edges, and slid it slowly across the table until it touched the edge of Owen's soup bowl. "My grandfather gave me that when I had the croup," Victor said quietly. "He told me if I kept it in my pocket, it would weigh me down so the wind couldn't take my breath away." Owen stared at the heavy silver disc. Small boys are fundamentally magpies. The gleam of old, heavy metal was irresistible. His small, ink-stained fingers reached out and closed over the dollar. It was far too big for his palm. "Victor," Nora warned, her voice trembling. Victor stood up. The red vinyl seat gave a long, sighing decompression. He towered over the booth, his silver-streaked hair catching the dull, fluorescent light of the diner. "I bought the old Henderson farmhouse on the edge of town," Victor said, looking down at Nora. "The one with the apple orchard. I paid cash an hour ago. The wire transfer to Boston Children's settled at noon. Your debt is zeroed out." Nora stood up to meet him, her knees shaking beneath her jeans. "I will pay you back every cent. $50 a week for the rest of my natural life." "You won't pay me a dime," Victor said softly. He stepped out into the aisle, buttoning the center button of his charcoal coat. "Tomorrow morning at 8, a man named Warren is going to deliver a commercial-grade HEPA air filtration unit to your duplex. You will let him install it in Owen's bedroom. If you try to pack those suitcases tonight, Nora, I will know before your Subaru hits the interstate. Don't run. The roads are slick, the boy's lungs are weak, and I am entirely out of patience." He didn't wait for her to answer. He turned and walked out his Italian Oxfords, making that same dry, rhythmic thud-click against the floorboards, leaving Nora standing in the smell of stale coffee, holding her breath, until the double-glass doors swung shut against the rain. By 11 p.m., the rain had turned into a hard-driving Maine sleet that rattled against the bedroom window like thrown gravel. Nora sat on the edge of her mattress in the dark, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical whoosh hiss of the $500 medical dehumidifier Victor's man had dropped on her porch 3 hours earlier. In the next room, Owen was sleeping deeply, his breathing noticeably quieter, the silver dollar clutched so tightly in his fist that Nora hadn't been able to pry it loose when she tucked him in. Floorboards creaked on the front porch. It wasn't a stealthy approach. It was heavy, deliberate steps, designed to be heard through the thin walls of a cheap rental. Nora didn't grab the phone. She didn't call the police. She stood up, wrapped a thick wool cardigan over her pajama top, walked through the dark kitchen, and unlocked the deadbolt. Victor was sitting on the top step of her porch, his back resting against the peeling white paint of the support column. He had taken off his topcoat. He wore a simple black crewneck sweater, his sleeves pushed up to his forearms, exposing the pale, dense hair on his wrists and the faint white surgical scar running across the back of his left hand. Beside him sat a cardboard tray holding 2 large paper cups from a 24-hour gas station down the road. "The coffee is terrible," Victor said without turning around. "It tastes like scorched cardboard." Nora stood in the doorway, letting the freezing draft blow around her bare ankles. "Why are you sitting on my wood, Victor?" "Because if I came inside, you'd feel cornered," he said simply. He picked up one of the cups and held it backward over his shoulder. "Drink it anyway, it's warm." She hesitated, then stepped out onto the porch, leaving the front door cracked an inch behind her, so she could hear Owen if he coughed. She took the cup. The paper was hot against her frozen palms. She didn't sit beside him. She leaned against the opposite column, 6 feet away, watching the sleet turn the streetlights into glowing white halos. "Richard Morrison told me you were in Chicago," Victor said, staring out into the dark street. "When the subpoena cleared in year 2, I had him pull the tax records for every logistics firm in the Midwest." I spent $80,000 on private investigators in Cook County looking for a woman who didn't exist. I took a bus to Boston, Nora said, sipping the bitter, scalding gas station coffee. Then I bought a used car for $2,200 cash from a guy behind a body shop in Somerville. I drove north until the sign stopped saying Interstate and started saying Town Road. It wasn't hard. You people only look for paper trails. You don't know how to look for people who pay their electric bills with money orders. Victor let out a short, dry exhale that might have been a laugh in another decade. No, we don't. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the tink-tink-tink of freezing rain hitting the tin roof of the porch. "Why did you do it?" Nora asked. The question had sat at the bottom of her throat like a swallowed razor blade for 2,000 days. Now that it was out, her voice didn't shake. It was remarkably clear. "The Delaware grand jury," Victor said. He turned his head slowly to look at her, the harsh porch light carving deep shadows beneath his eyes. The Eastern District had 3 federal informants inside the waterfront unions. They were preparing a 34-count indictment under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The preliminary asset forfeiture orders included the primary corporate accounts, the payroll reserves, and the personal holdings of every executive officer. He looked down at his own hands, rubbing his thumb over his scarred knuckle. "If I had kept you on the payroll, Nora, you would have been named as an unindicted co-conspirator within 48 hours. Federal prosecutors don't go after the guys with the lawyers first. They go after the 25-year-old assistants. They put them in windowless rooms in federal buildings, tell them they're looking at 12 years in a minimum security facility in Danbury, and wait for them to cry until they sign fabricated witness statements." Nora gripped her paper cup until the rim buckled. "So you slid a severance package across a table and didn't even turn around to look at my face." "If I had looked at your face," Victor said, his voice dropping into a raw, unprotected whisper, "I wouldn't have let you walk out the door." And 2 weeks later, federal